Welcome to Module 4, the Oral Torah. There is a historical prelude to all the things we'll be talking about today. In the book of Nehemiah, we already read that the Israelites read the Torah publicly and that it was consulted. So if you look at this here, when the seventh month came, all the people gathered together in the courtyard in front of the water gate. They told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of Moses' teachings, which the Lord had commanded Israel to follow. And then Ezra the priest brought the teachings in front of the assembly. This included men and women and any children who could understand what they heard. And this took place on the first day of the seventh month. From daybreak until noon, he read from it in the courtyard in front of all, so that they could understand it. In antiquity, there were two centers of Jewish settlement. One was in Israel, Palestine, and where the center was eventually in Tiberias, where the leadership settled, but also along the coast here and further inside, Sepphoris, Caesarea, and all that. There were some differences between those. Caesarea was a cosmopolitan city, and concentrated on the study of the Bible, for instance. And there are also differences in synagogue architecture and decorations and customs and all. Jews had also lived in Egypt for a very long time, since before the end of the Judean kingdom. And there was some mass immigration after Alexander the Great's death in the 4th century BCE. There were also sizable Jewish communities in Syria, especially in Antioch, in Greece, which is all here off our map, and up here in Cyprus, in Rome, and in other areas as well. In Babylonia, which is the second big center I'd like to mention, the Jewish community, or by that time really the Israelite community, dates back to the 6th century BCE. But we don't have many sources until the 1st century BCE rolled around. Jews lived in many areas here. Most spoke Aramaic, sort of the lingua franca, the language everybody spoke. Some also Greek. There was a functioning civil authority in Babylonia, that is, they really administers all of their affairs. And there was much conflict between what we would call civil and religious leadership. Jews and Jewish communities were a part of the larger world. They were not untouched by what was going on around them. In the Roman Empire, Jews had been assured religious rights. This was an enormous privilege that no other communities in the Roman Empire really had. And I brought you here a declaration of Claudius on Jewish rights from the year 41. So really only a few decades before the problems that we'll be talking about in a second broke out. One of the many important rulers or personalities of the time was Herod the Great, who undertook many building enterprises. Here I am bringing you a photo of the city of Caesarea on the Mediterranean, where he built an enormous amphitheater and a port. The port is today an important archaeological site. All of this really is, and the amphitheater is used for concerts. Herod might be best known for the great expansions he undertook of the temple, the Second Temple. Here you can see a model in Jerusalem. It was a large edifice, really. Some of its walls are still standing today and are venerated by many Jews. It's the Western Wall, and on its top right here is today one of the holiest mosques. There were many revolts in the Roman Empire, for instance, a Druid revolt in Germany. All of them were caused by economic distress, especially extortive taxation. This was combined with messianic speculation, so this with the idea that things could get better, and they were often led by people who were already leaders. This revolt here, the Jewish revolt, that's also known as the First Jewish War, was also a revolt against taxation. And it was a revolt against the military first on the coast and then in Jerusalem. A really bloody war ensued with Titus and Vespasian, both important Roman figures, eventually emperors, who were the main players on the Roman side. It is in this war that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. The second revolt I'd like to mention here as sort of a prelude to the rabbinic period was the Bar Kokhba revolt, thus named because one of its most important leaders at its height and especially its end was a man called Simeon Bar Kokhba. In this revolt, initially the Romans were defeated, and for about 2 years the rebels gained control over Jerusalem. They struck coins, and I haven't actually given you any, I wanted to. And messianic hopes were pinned on the leader of the revolt, Bar Kokhba. But eventually they had to retreat to Betar, which fell, as tradition had it, on the 9th of the month of Av, which is a day of mourning and a fast day to this day that is combined to all kinds of national catastrophes. We'll talk about it another time. In the summer of 135. Some people fled to caves and so on, and skirmishes lasted for some more time. As a result, Jerusalem was renamed and was named Alia Capitolina. The Jews were officially prohibited from living there, and some leftovers from this period are still visible. So for instance here, this is the official entrance to the Damascus gate from one of the gates from East Jerusalem, and here underneath you have constructions from that era. What were the consequences of the wars? Number one really is the rise of the rabbis. But as a result of the defeat, really, Jerusalem was plowed up. It became a Roman colony. It was called, as we heard before, Colonia Aelia Capitolina, and Judea became Syria Palestina. This was followed by large-scale destruction, many massacres, and the slave markets were filled with Jewish slaves. Hadrian began to oppress the Jewish religion in Palestine. There were prohibitions, for instance, of public prayer. But really this was, and that's what's important for us, the rise of the rabbis. Synagogues came to be used more often. They had been around before, but they now became sort of temple substitutes. And the ritual that had been based on the temple moved into the community and especially the family, where it has stayed till this day. There was a renewed emphasis on study, a renewed emphasis on prayer as well. So who are these guys, really, the rabbis? What do we mean when we say the rabbis, or when the texts that you're reading say the rabbis? They mean, for one, a religious elite. And they mean, two, a title. How do we know it's a title? And as in so many cases when we talk about this era, one of our main sources is the New Testament, where, of course, rabbi is a title given to Jesus. The rabbis were a religious elite in post-70 Palestine. They were not the only elite. There were many others. I'm not talking about them, but they had a vision that lasted. They became prominent at about the same time when bishops became a prominent force within the growing church. They had really many functions. The title rabbi is often mentioned in inscriptions. It's used in many Semitic languages as a honorific title, rab as a honorific title. And inscriptions don't really tell us what it meant to be a rabbi. For instance, the chief officials at synagogues were usually not rabbis, but they were called presbyters or elders, although rabbis appear as donors. They did not control the synagogues, ever, not in Israel, not in the diaspora. So they're so important because they constitute Jerusalem as we know it today. With the destruction of the temple, new attention was placed on religious observances in daily life. Again, something that had happened or that had existed before the destruction, but became more important now. The rabbis provided a structure that was needed to survive as a community, with rituals, stressing the importance of the home and the family, and especially the sense that the holiness of the temple now rested in the home. There was an emphasis on ethical conduct, on family life, on prayer, on business affairs. The canon of the Bible now became fixed, and so did prayer to an extent. So what do we mean by oral Torah? The rabbis realized that the Bible did not suffice as a guide for everyday life, and that new situations demanded new solutions. For example, the Bible does not go into details on how holidays should be exactly celebrated, how animals should be slaughtered, or how people should get married and divorced. And the solution was the oral Torah. It was the idea that at Mount Sinai, and here I brought you a photo of what's today seen as Mount Sinai, God had given Israel the Torah, that is, a contract, a body of texts. For the rabbis, and for Rabbinic Judaism, which is the Judaism as it exists till this day, mostly, this meant that there were two Torahs, one written and together with it an oral Torah, a term encompassing all future interpretations of the law as well. New decisions are seen as correctives to new developments. The rabbis kept a distinction, and they stressed that decisions based on the Bible superseded ideas based on later interpretations. Judaism was then based on the twin revelations of the written and the oral Torah. Now, oral here is a somewhat misleading term because all of these texts are today written down. But for many centuries, people who studied the Torah and any texts related with the rabbinic library would commit large parts of these works to memory. This is still the case today. In fact, in antiquity, there were people around who were sort of reference works. They worked like a data bank, a memory bank, and they would commit big pieces of this by heart, and they would be consulted with questions. The Mishnah is the oldest datable rabbinic document. It was codified in the 3rd century CE, traditionally around the year 220 by Rabbi Judah. It is a summary of traditional law as interpreted by the Pharisaic rabbinic movement that does not follow the Bible, but a new structure with its own topical arrangement. It's divided into 6 sections that cover many aspects of Jewish religious and social behavior. And the sections are seeds, festivals, women, damages, holy things related to ritual, and purifications. Its claims are based on the oral Torah given by Moses, namely that there was, in addition to the Torah, to the Pentateuch, another body of precedent and interpretation that was passed down from Moses. What's the Talmud? The Talmud is a passage-by-passage commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is about as long as a desk dictionary. The Talmud is more the length of an encyclopedia. In fact, there are two, one written each in the 2 great centers of Jewish settlement, one in Jerusalem, Palestine, and one in Iraq. So I brought you here, or I want to show you here, the copy, one volume of my Talmud. Here it is. You get a feeling for how big this is. There are smaller ones. I can't read the smaller ones, so it's the big ones that count for me. And let me show you the opening here. So give me a second. Wait. Here you can see a volume, a 1 page. This is a product of rabbinic culture. Today, when it has been printed in this way since the early modern period, Bibles too, by the way, were printed in this way. How did it work? Here in the middle, you would have the Mishnah, and then you would have some ancient commentary, and then you would have medieval commentaries all around, and they're arranged according to certain rules. Rashi, whom we also already encountered, is always printed in the middle of the work, And the generation of his grandsons and the interpreters that followed, that lived sort of a few generations after, they're back here. And then there are more commentaries on the sides and often in the back as well. And I wanted to show you one further feature of this, which I don't know if it's going to come out. Let me see. Yes. So for those of you who know Hebrew, you will notice that this is the letter bet, that is the letter B. And that's the first page of the Talmud. What does that mean? Why do you think a text that is quite important to traditional Jews would begin with page B? Oh, hold on. It begins with B because the idea is, and this one here actually does as well, the one you have here, so I could have spared myself schlepping that big thing around. It begins with page 2 because there's the idea that no interpretation is ever perfect, and that commentary begins on page 2. It is written in Aramaic, that is the vernacular, with some Hebrew interspersed. It's studied in conversation, in chevruta, that is in sort of a dialectical principle. And I brought you, and that's completely different, but a similar idea, a photo of the school of Athens as imagined by a 16th century painter. The idea that complex ideas are best studied with a study partner, and you might have made the same discovery for yourself. So the Mishnah, and that's this bit up here, was written in Hebrew, the language of the past, of tradition, of liturgy and scholarship. But the Gemara, the commentary down here, was written in Aramaic, in the vernacular of the time. And today it's available in English as well. It records arguments of more than conversations of more than 2,000 individual sages that are thinking about specific ways to resolve issues. It's a basis for Jewish law per se. It's not a law or a legal code, but rather it is the embodiment of hundreds of years of rabbinic learning. So if this is the Mishnah, a text that was codified in the 3rd century, and this is the Talmud, a conversation or a text that was codified by maybe the 7th, 8th century, then we have Rashi in here, 11th, 12th century, his descendants, 12th, 13th century, and then all kinds of later conversations up here. It's the basis for formulating systematic legal texts. It emerged from the centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia and Palestine, but it assumed where the Babylonian Talmud assumed preferred status and is the one that's widely used today. It's complex, it's far-reaching, it's often free associational, all this. The conversation continues. It's still going on. In this unit, you'll be reading some responsa, some legal opinions that are based ultimately also on the discussions that we have on these pages. Another way to think about this is to think about this as a hyperlinked text. It's quite complex. You need quite a bit of background to really find your way around on it, but anyone can read some of these texts and can follow the argument with a little bit of explanations. So back to the idea that all this rests on the Hebrew Bible / the Old Testament. It's the idea that the oral Torah was given to Israel on Sinai, and here you have a photo from the top of Mount Sinai, which I think is quite powerful. You can imagine how amazing this was at a time when you walked up all of those mountains on foot, as people still do today. So it's the idea that God had given Israel the Torah, a contract, a body of texts. And the rabbis say that there are 2 Torahs, one written and together with it an oral Torah, a term that encompasses all future interpretations of the law as well. This reinterprets the term Israel. It encompasses all Jews, those of the past who might have been present as Israelites on Mount Sinai, those of the present, those of the unborn, yet unborn, the future Jews. It includes converts as well. In many ways, this is a genius idea. It means that legal decisions can be seen as a corrective to new developments. Yes, there are some distinctions. Laws that can be based directly on the Bible are seen as more important than those of the rabbis, but the principle really stands. So let's look at an example. There were two schools of expositions, you could say, of the oral law. They were named after Hillel and Shammai, after their founders, really, who perhaps lived around the time of the era, and the schools were around until the beginning of the 2nd century CE. So here's an example. A Gentile came before Shammai and he said, "Convert me, but on the condition that you can teach me the whole of the Torah while I stand on one foot." And Shammai repelled him. He pushed him away. And then the Gentile, the non-Jew, went to Hillel, and Hillel said, "What is hateful for you, don't do to others. Don't do anything to a friend that you hate yourself." That's the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. The Gemara explains the difference between these two approaches of Shammai and Hillel by saying, one should always be gentle like Hillel and not like Shammai. Very little is known about either the founders or the identity of their pupils. There are some 350 debates preserved between the two houses, and they make up the bulk of the material from the last generations of the Second Temple period. There are clashes between different opinions and approaches. Both were deemed legitimate. Both were seen as the word of the living God, as the Palestinian Talmud says so beautifully. Many scholars thought that the conflicts between them reflect individual traits of the founders. Hillel was kind, Shammai was stern. Another interpretation held that the basis was a social and economic conflict, with Shammai belonging to the upper and Hillel representing the lower classes. There is absolutely no proof for this. It seems clear, however, that Bet Shammai tended to follow a more literal interpretation of material, and when it came to halacha, was more conservative. Conservative in the sense of halachic innovation. At what would become the main seat of the rabbinic academy in Palestine, Bet Hillel, that is the house of Hillel and his teachings became dominant. But some mystical thinkers hold that Bet Shammai's halacha would be, or way of thinking, would be the one in the world to come. That is, when in a perfect time people would be much more stringent than they are today.